It is a truth universally unremarked that umbrellas, those modest guardians against the inclemency of the English sky, seldom feature in murder inquiries. They are not dramatic instruments like stilettos or sabres, and their natural habitat, the hall stand, renders them more ornamental than operatic. Nevertheless, it was precisely an umbrella, dry, abandoned, and wholly ignored, that first drew Lord Peter Deathbread Wimsey's attention to the curious demise of Dr. Ambrose Gallowglass. "It's a damned impolite thing," Lord Peter observed, addressing no one in particular, "to leave one's umbrella unaccompanied in company, particularly when the weather demands otherwise. Neglect of social convention is the true herald of disaster." He stood, coat unbuttoned, trilby in hand, in the octagonal vestibule of Staveley Grange. A red-bricked Gothic confection crouched uneasily between two rather better-mannered hills in the North Riding. It had the look of a house built not by an architect, but by an enthusiast, which is to say, a man with more passion than perspective. Its towers were too narrow, its windows too pointed, and its chimneys too eager to assert themselves. One would not be entirely surprised to find a gargoyle snoring by the fire. The umbrella in question, a sensible black affair with a polished maple handle, leaned as though faint from exhaustion against a rack by the door. Outside, the rain drummed a persistent tattoo on the stained glass panels, a mournful accompaniment to the murmurs and muffled sobs issuing from the drawing-room beyond. Dr. Gallowglass, retired cleric, amateur medievalist, and local scholar of dubious ecclesiastical architecture, had been found earlier that morning face down on the library hearthrug, his head neatly canted at a blasphemous angle. The local constable, a large-boned and literal-minded man named Dobson, had suggested apoplexy. The housekeeper, Mrs. Vetch, preferred to call it a visitation. Lady Staveley, the widow and mistress of the house, declined to call it anything at all, but made a pointed request for Lord Peter's assistance, murmuring something about his reputation for delicacy in dreadful matters. Lord Peter had been visiting an old school friend nearby and, never one to ignore the lure of a promising corpse, accepted with all the enthusiasm of a boy invited backstage at the theatre. He now turned to Inspector Redvers of the Northallerton CID, who was scribbling notes with a mechanical pencil and a furrowed brow. "Tell me, Redvers, do you observe anything remarkable about that umbrella?" The inspector, who had seen enough of Wimsey's methods to dread their implications, sighed. "It's an umbrella, my lord." "Precisely," said Wimsey, eyes gleaming. "And yet no one has claimed it. It stands here, forlorn, when every other coat and hat has fled indoors, and more pertinently, it is not wet." Redvers blinked. "But it's been raining since dawn." "Exactly," said Wimsey, "and therefore we may presume that whoever placed it here did so either before the rain began or—" he paused, savouring the effect, "after the storm ceased, which it hasn't. Thus, we have either a time-travelling curate or someone who never went outside at all." Redvers glanced about. "Seems to me someone just brought it in early." "Seems indeed," said Wimsey cheerfully, "but one must always inquire who. Who entered Staveley Grange before the storm? Who brought a dry umbrella? And why did they leave it? A man may forget a greatcoat in a crisis, but never his umbrella. The Englishman's soul is stored in the ferule." Before the inspector could object to this generalization, the drawing-room door creaked open and Mrs. Vetch, angular and sulphurous, emerged, dabbing her eyes with something that might once have been lace. "They're ready for you, my lord," she said in tones that implied martyrdom. "Capital," said Wimsey. "Come along, Redvers. Let us inspect the body of the departed scholar and ascertain whether his murder was committed with a sharp instrument, a blunt instrument, or, most scandalously, a degree in ecclesiastical Latin." And with that, Lord Peter sauntered down the corridor, pausing only to pat the head of a porcelain bulldog and admire a particularly bad watercolour of Canterbury Cathedral. Behind them, the umbrella remained exactly where it was, dry, disregarded, and, if Wimsey was right, about to become singularly significant. Lord Peter entered the drawing-room with a lightness of tread that might have seemed irreverent were it not for the unmistakable sharpness behind his lazy eyes. The room itself had the faded dignity of minor gentry. Dark panelled walls, sagging floral curtains of uncertain hue, and a fire that smouldered, not out of necessity, but out of habit. It smelt faintly of lavender polish, coal dust, and the peculiar airlessness that only money without taste can purchase. Lady Staveley, upright on a brocaded armchair, gave the impression of being upholstered in the same fabric as the furniture, elegant in the sense of being too rigid to collapse. Her eyes, pale and slightly watery, fixed on whimsy with a combination of relief and what might pass for restrained irritation. "You are very good to come," she said, not rising. "Though it seems, as usual, no one knows quite what has happened." "My dear Lady Staveley," said Whimsy, dropping into a nearby chair with the sort of languid grace that made even furniture seem better bred. "The world is full of mysteries, but very few of them involve dead medievalists in drawing-rooms." She gave a thin smile. "Ambrose was found in the library." "Indeed," said Whimsy. "Libraries are so very suggestive, don't you find? All that silence and the faint smell of ink and old gilt. You may see the body if you must, but do speak to Mrs. Vetch first. She's beside herself, of course, but she discovered him." "Splendid," said Whimsy. "A devoted domestic always adds flavour to a case. One never knows what despair or dusting conceals. Is she quite certain he was dead?" "He was quite cold," said Lady Staveley flatly, "and very much the wrong colour." "Poor taste in both regards," murmured Whimsy. He rose and made his excuses, leaving Redvers speaking in low, official tones to the lady of the house. Outside, the corridor stretched dim and still. The gloom of late morning filtered through diamond-paned windows, casting long, distorted shapes across the floor. The weather had not relented. The sound of the rain was now more pronounced, like a metronome set too slowly. He found Mrs. Vetch in the morning-room, a cheerless space too angular for comfort and too floral for dignity. She had taken up station at the tea-table, though no one had been offered any. She stood at his approach, smoothing her apron in nervous jerks. "His lordship," she began, and faltered. "I've never seen anything like it, sir, not in all my years here. And I was here before the war, mind." Whimsy bowed slightly, and survived it no doubt with honour. "Now then, Mrs. Vetch, would you be so good as to tell me exactly how you came upon the late Dr. Gallowglass?" She looked at him with wide, slightly reddened eyes, and her fingers gripped the hem of her apron like a woman bracing for storm. "It were just past 8. I always bring him his breakfast tray at 10 minutes after. He liked it precise. 'A man's mind,' he said, 'is most fit for reading at 8:15, provided tea arrives first.'" Whimsy nodded. "A man of conviction. Did he breakfast alone?" "Always. No one else rises so early in this house, except me. I went in with the tray, eggs, kippers, a roll like usual, and there he was, on the carpet by the fireplace. His neck—" She made a small, helpless gesture. "It was all wrong." Said Whimsy. "Had anything in the room been disturbed?" "I don't think so, sir. The books was all in place. His papers were stacked on the desk like he left them the night before. But he hadn't touched his tea." Whimsy's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Interesting. Was the fire lit?" "No, sir. He said it distracted his thinking. Said flames were too like people, always moving and never making sense." Whimsy smiled faintly. "How very true." He turned to pace the room. "And you did not hear anything unusual in the night? No cries, bumps, disembodied whispers of malice?" She blinked. "No, sir. Only the bells." Whimsy turned. "Bells?" Mrs. Vetch looked suddenly embarrassed. Just the chapel bell. The little one in the east wing tower. Rang once. Just once. That was round midnight, I think." "Is the chapel in use?" "Oh, no. Not for years. Not since the old master passed. Dr. Gallowglass used to sit in there sometimes, reading. Said it helped him think. But no one touches the bell. You need a rope, and it's stiff as bones. Haven't heard it in, well, not since. Whimsy's expression grew thoughtful. And last night was particularly wet. Climbing into towers to ring bells would be an eccentric choice of midnight activity. Mrs. Vetch shivered. We all said it must have been the wind, but it was such a clean sound, like someone meant it. Indeed, said Whimsy quietly. What do you know of Dr. Gallowglass's mood of late? Oh, he was his usual self. Quiet, sharp, didn't care for nonsense. But last week, well, he had a row with Mr. Julian. Whimsy looked up. Julian? Mr. Julian Daker, Lady Staveley's nephew. He's staying just now. They had a row about something in the library. Books, I think. Mr. Julian stormed out, said the old man was stuck in the 12th century and needed to join the living. Said Whimsy. An unkind remark, but not, perhaps, unprovoked. She hesitated. He said something else, too. Something strange. Said Dr. Gallowglass was hiding behind his pretend past, like all cowards. Whimsy's brows lifted. How very dramatic. Was Mr. Julian in the house last night? Yes, sir. He went up after dinner. He drinks sometimes. But we all do now and then, don't we? Indeed, said Whimsy. Some of us professionally. At that moment, Redverse appeared in the doorway, a trifle pink in the face. They're ready in the library, my lord. Whimsy nodded to Mrs. Vetch and followed. The library, when he entered, was exactly as it ought to be. Oak shelves groaning with vellum and dust, a faintly ecclesiastical air to the furniture, and above all, a heavy stillness that clung to the walls like mildew. Dr. Gallowglass lay prone on the hearthrug, his body covered now with a light linen sheet. Whimsy knelt, lifting one corner gently. The face beneath was grey, the lips slightly parted, and the neck, yes, unmistakably, was broken. No sign of struggle, said Redverse quietly. No marks on the hands, and look here. He pointed to the old man's slippered feet, one of which was twisted inward at an unnatural angle. Whimsy surveyed the fireplace. No pokers displaced. The coals had not been stirred. A thin line of chalk dust ringed the andiron, marking, presumably, the position it always occupied. Have the medical chaps had a look? Dr. Elston came just before you. He thinks it was either a fall or someone turned his head round like a cork. Charming, murmured Whimsy. He rose and moved to the desk. Papers lay neatly aligned. A Latin volume, De Casibus Virorum Illustrium, stood open under a brass page-weight. A set of marginal notes, tight and spidery, trailed down one edge in the same ink as a blot still fresh upon the blotter. He reached forward, touched it with his finger, and turned back to Redverse. This was written very near to the time of death, he said. And yet he never made it back to bed, nor called for help. Perhaps he slipped, struck his head. Perhaps, said Whimsy, non-committal. His gaze swept the room again, then stopped. Where is the umbrella stand in this room? Redverse looked confused. There isn't one. Why? Because, said Whimsy, half to himself, a man who enters through the front hall in the rain leaves an umbrella. But if a man enters by some other way, say, the chapel, he might forget the hall entirely, especially if he were very wet, very angry, and in a hurry to make someone else very dead. Redverse stared. You think... Whimsy raised a hand. I think it is far too soon to think anything. Except this. The umbrella stayed in the hall, but someone else did not. And with that, Lord Peter turned back to the body of Dr. Gallowglass and smiled faintly, as though the dead man had just shared with him a private joke. Whimsy stood quite still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the open book atop the desk, then slowly closed it with a soft thud. The binding gave a faint crack, like a joint settling in an old man's spine. He turned the volume over and examined the inside cover, where a small ex libris sticker bore the arms of New College, Oxford, and the neatly penned name, A. Gallowglass, 1903. "An old friend," Whimsy murmured, brushing away a speck of dust with the tip of one finger. Even his books remained loyal. Redvers cleared his throat. "What now, my lord?" "Now, Redvers," Whimsy said with a sudden briskness, "we find out who else heard the bell, if indeed it was a bell and not some nocturnal pang of conscience. I'd be interested to know what Mr. Julian Daker has to say for himself, preferably while sober." Redvers nodded. "He's upstairs. Shall I fetch him?" "No, no," said Whimsy, moving to the door. "Let's take the air, as the Victorians said before they shot themselves. I find suspects are far more conversational when not cornered. Besides, I should like to see the chapel." They crossed the hall again, and Whimsy paused briefly, once more, before the umbrella stand. He frowned, then stepped closer and bent to examine the base. A faint smear of damp on the parquet flooring marked where the umbrella had been earlier. He touched the edge of the stand and brought his finger up. "Dust," he said simply. Redvers raised an eyebrow. "So it hasn't been used lately?" "Or it has only just been used. Consider, it is dry now, but the ring of moisture suggests it was wet. Earlier this morning, perhaps before the discovery. And yet, why leave it out in plain sight? If one were attempting subtlety, one might place it elsewhere. Unless, of course, one hoped it would be mistaken for belonging to someone else." "You're saying it was planted?" Whimsy tilted his head. "Let's not say anything so vulgar as planted. Perhaps it merely lingered. But I should very much like to know whose umbrella it is, and when it arrived here." They stepped outside beneath the shelter of a stone portico. The rain was less aggressive now, more a persistent mist that made the landscape glisten like varnished sorrow. The path to the chapel curved eastward behind a hedge of yew, trimmed into trembling submission. The air smelled of sodden grass and old stone. The chapel itself was squat and ivy-choked, with a square tower that looked as though it had given up aspiring to heaven and settled for defending against bats. Whimsy pushed the creaking door open with 2 fingers. It gave a hollow groan in response. Inside, the chapel was dim but dry, lit faintly by grey daylight filtering through cracked panes of stained glass. A stone altar stood at one end, bare but for a thick layer of dust. The pews were narrow and unwelcoming. Whimsy walked the central aisle slowly, tapping a finger along the edge of each pew as though reading Braille. "It's curious," he said. "What is?" "There's no sign anyone's been here. No footprints, no disturbance of dust. And yet Mrs. Vetch says the bell rang." Redvers tilted his head. "Could be a mechanical fault. Old wiring or an animal." "An animal clever enough to tug a frayed bell rope?" Whimsy stepped into the tiny vestry to the side of the altar. The bell rope descended from a trap door in the ceiling, taut and perfectly clean. "No spider webs here, but no fingerprints either, which in this place," he added, "might almost count as unnatural." They exited through the side door and re-entered the main house through the servants' corridor. It smelled faintly of onions and soap. In the kitchen, a maid glanced up from peeling potatoes and turned pale at the sight of them. Whimsy gave her a courteous nod, but did not stop. He continued on toward the stairs. Julian Daker was found in the smoking room, slouched with an expression that hovered somewhere between post-libationary remorse and mild disdain. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired, and possessed of the sort of lean handsomeness that appeared to come at the expense of warmth. At Whimsy's entrance, he rose, smoothing his tie reflexively. "I suppose you'll want to ask about Uncle Ambrose," he said. "Only if it's inconvenient," Whimsy replied lightly, sinking into a leather armchair. "I find truth tends to emerge most clearly from the reluctant. If you'd prefer to be interrogated at some later hour, say 2:30 on Wednesday, I shall pencil it in." Julian gave a dry smile. No, get on with it. There's nothing to hide. Splendid. I understand you had words with Dr. Gallowglass last week. Is that supposed to mean something? It's supposed to mean precisely what it does. You were heard disagreeing, loudly, with the late scholar over something involving books and the nature of time. That sort of thing can grow personal. Julian shrugged. We disagreed. He was my uncle's friend, not mine. Always buried in Latin and cathedrals. I tried to tell him to live in the real world. And how did he take that? With a great deal of contempt and a lecture on Aquinas. He thought I was lazy and frivolous, and I thought he was crusty and irrelevant. Neither of us was wrong. And yet you stayed under the same roof. Julian looked away. It wasn't by choice. I've had difficulties recently. Business trouble. My aunt offered to let me convalesce here until I could get back on my feet. Uncle Ambrose wasn't thrilled. And where were you last night? Whimsy asked. In my room. I went up around 10. Had a brandy. Read for a bit. Slept badly. Did you hear the chapel bell? Julian looked at him sharply. No. Why would I? No reason, but it was heard. Just once, around midnight. Julian frowned. I must have been asleep, or not paying attention. I tend to tune out the old noises in this place. Quite understandable. Did you happen to go for a walk last night? The garden, perhaps? In this weather? Some people find the rain invigorating, or useful. Julian narrowed his eyes. Are you accusing me of something? Only of being unusually defensive, said Whimsy lightly. I'm afraid it's a bad habit I've picked up, suspecting people when they become less than charming. He stood, brushing non-existent lint from his sleeve. One final question, Mr. Daker. Do you own a black umbrella with a polished maple handle? Julian blinked. No, I've a cheap collapsible thing from Cambridge. Broke the spring last month. Haven't replaced it yet. Pity, they make such marvelous gifts. Well, thank you, Mr. Daker. You've been most enlightening. As they stepped back into the corridor, Redvers murmured, What do you make of him? Carefully evasive. Not lying in any vulgar sense, but trimming the edges. It's a family disease. Redvers nodded slowly. What now? Whimsy tapped his chin. There's still the matter of the bell. If it was rung deliberately, and at that hour, someone intended it to be heard. Not by the whole house, necessarily, but by a particular person. It's a summons of sorts. The question is, for whom? As they passed the foot of the staircase, Whimsy paused again at the umbrella stand. He reached into the base and carefully turned over the edge of the rubber matting. A small glint caught the light, something metallic wedged against the wood. He extracted it carefully and held it up. It was a button, plain, black, and quite damp. Redvers leaned closer. From a coat? Almost certainly. But not, I think, Dr. Gallowglass's. He never wore black, only that horrible brown tweed. So someone else was here this morning? Whimsy gave a faint smile. Oh no, Redvers. Someone was here last night. They left their umbrella to dry and forgot the button when they left in haste. And they went out through the chapel? Exactly. Whimsy looked toward the drawing room. Let us pay a visit to Lady Staveley again. I've a strong suspicion she knows more about her house guests than she's been inclined to admit. He stepped lightly away, his fingers turning the black button over and over like a miniature coin of gilt. Lady Staveley was seated precisely where Whimsy had left her, her teacup untouched and her gaze settled in a kind of brittle contemplation upon the fire. It was a fire too warm for the weather, which had turned mild with the midday mist, but perhaps Lady Staveley found comfort in needless heat, a habit not uncommon among those whose households had long since stopped refusing them. At the sound of their approach, she turned her head with slow deliberation. I assume, she said, you are returning not for tea but for suspicions. Only for enlightenment, Lady Staveley, Whimsy replied smoothly. Suspicion is too coarse a garment for this house. I seek something more diaphanous." She offered a tight smile, polished by years of county luncheons and Anglican reticence. "Then I fear I have nothing to offer. I told you all I know." "Indeed," Whimsy said, settling into the armchair opposite her with feline grace. "But sometimes the key is not in what one says, but in what one sees, and what one elects not to remark upon. For instance, I wonder if you noticed that an umbrella was removed from the stand this morning." Her eyes flicked, ever so slightly, toward the hall beyond the door, then back to him. "The servants might know. I seldom supervise such minutiae." "Quite so. And yet you've always struck me as a woman keenly aware of her surroundings. You've kept this house in such perfect order, nothing out of place. The chapel, for instance, still dusted despite being unused, even the bell works." Lady Staveley's lips thinned. "Is that so?" "Yes," said Whimsy, examining the button in his palm. "And curiously, I found this wedged into the base of the umbrella stand, still damp, though the fire in the drawing-room has been merrily crackling for hours. Now, I'm no expert in millinery, but this looks more like the kind of button one might find on a woman's coat than a man's." Redvers gave a brief, startled glance, but said nothing. Whimsy turned the button over once more before slipping it into his pocket. "It's a rather elegant make, Aldwych and Cooper, I believe. Not easy to find outside the West End. Which raises the question, who among your guests has both a taste for high tailoring and a reason to creep out into the rain at midnight?" Lady Staveley set down her cup with a click. "I cannot imagine what you're suggesting, Lord Peter." "Nor can I," said Whimsy pleasantly. "It's the burden of not knowing. I find it intolerable, and so I ask questions, endlessly, some say maddeningly, until knowledge, like a reluctant debutante, agrees to be courted." A silence fell, thickened by the restrained crackle of the fire and the faint ticking of the mantel clock. At length, Lady Staveley's composure cracked, not entirely, but along one hairline seam. "I suppose," she said slowly, "that if you must know, I heard the bell too." "Ah." Whimsy's tone was velvet. "Then why not say so earlier?" "I wasn't certain it was real. I thought perhaps I had imagined it. Some echo from an old dream. I haven't heard that bell since my husband died, and it was only once." "And did you leave your room?" "No," she said with a trace too much insistence. "Of course not." "Then let me rephrase. Did anyone else leave their room? A door opening down the corridor? Footsteps? The smell of wet wool and good perfume, perhaps?" She did not answer at once. Instead, she rose with slow dignity and moved to the window where the garden lay half-shrouded in mist. Her back was to them when she said, "I believe I heard someone on the stairs. Light steps, not a man's." "Which direction?" "Descending. Toward the chapel, I think. But I couldn't say for certain. I did not want to open my door and interfere." "Very wise," Whimsy said. "Interference can ruin a narrative." She turned then, and for a brief moment, something in her face suggested not fear, but shame. "You believe someone left the house, used the chapel door to avoid notice. But for what purpose? To meet someone, perhaps, or to do something in secret. The dead have the misfortune of being silent in these inquiries, which leaves us reliant on the living." There was another beat of silence, during which Whimsy tilted his head slightly and added, "Tell me, what do you make of Miss Chloe Devonish?" That did the trick. Lady Staveley blinked. "Miss Devonish? She's charming, pale in the right light, a little too interested in ancient manuscripts for someone who also discusses tennis with such fluency. I've always found incongruous women rather fascinating." "She's Julian's friend," said Lady Staveley, composed once more. "She arrived last week. I don't know much about her, only that she's modern." "Modern," Whimsy repeated. "How frightfully dangerous." Lady Staveley gave him a sharp look, but said nothing. Whimsy rose. "Thank you. This has been most illuminating. I think I shall take a stroll. Perhaps run into Miss Devonish before lunch. Redvers?" They found Miss Devonish precisely where one expected someone who wished to appear inconspicuous, under a parasol in the conservatory, alone, reading a novel too literary to enjoy and too thinly veiled to believe. She looked up as they approached, her eyes a little too wide. "Lord Peter," she said, closing her book with the same delicacy one might use to snap a neck. "Enjoying the weather?" "It's charmingly funereal," he replied. "Do you mind if I interrupt your communion with Mr. E.M. Forster?" "Not at all. I doubt he was saying anything important." She gestured to a chair. "What's the latest on Dr. Gallowglass? Or are you not allowed to say?" "Not forbidden, just ill-advised," said Whimsy, sitting. "Too many premature conclusions spoil a perfectly good mystery. But I do wonder, were you acquainted with the late doctor?" "Only slightly. He corrected my pronunciation of Tesserae once. A man of principle. Tell me, Miss Devonish, do you often go for walks after midnight?" She froze, but recovered admirably. "Goodness, no. I've barely gone outside since we arrived. The weather's been biblical." "Indeed. Though I'm told someone did take a stroll last night. Left through the chapel, returned damp, misplaced a button. Surely you must have heard." She said nothing, only looked at him, the corner of her mouth twitching slightly. "Are you suggesting it was me?" "Certainly not. I never suggest, only observe. For instance, I observed a rather smart black coat of yours hanging near the back door yesterday, with buttons that matched this." He removed the token from his pocket, letting it gleam in his palm. Chloe's lips parted. Whether in denial or amusement, it was difficult to tell. "I did go outside," she said finally, "but not at midnight. It was early this morning, around 6. I couldn't sleep and the air helped. I walked to the edge of the grounds and back." "That's all?" "To the chapel." "No, just the garden." "Was anyone else up?" She hesitated. "I thought I saw Julian at the window. His room overlooks the path. But I'm not certain. I didn't speak to him." "And did you see anything unusual?" "No." A pause. "Except, perhaps the vestry door was ajar. But I didn't investigate." Whimsy nodded. "Curious." He stood. "Thank you, Miss Devonish. You've been very helpful. One last thing. Do you happen to know what Dr. Gallowglass was working on before he died?" She blinked. "Only vaguely. Something about medieval visions of time. Julian mocked it constantly." "Mockery is the sincerest form of ignorance," said Whimsy. "Good day." They left the conservatory, and Redvers leaned in. "She's hiding something." "They all are," Whimsy murmured. "But only one is hiding murder." Whimsy did not speak as they left the conservatory, merely adjusted the brim of his hat with a thoughtful hand, and paused at the threshold to glance back at the mist-muted garden, its hedges and stone paths fading gently into abstraction. "There's something dreadfully aesthetic about fog," he remarked as they walked. "A natural concealment for unnatural acts. Like a veil on a bride one suspects of bigamy." Redvers followed in silence until they reached the hall again, where the umbrella stand still stood in quiet indignation. The place was still and dim, its shadows elongated by the north-facing light. Whimsy paused before the racking, gazed at the empty space among the umbrellas with something like fondness. "It's always the things left behind that reveal the most," he said, crouching to inspect the base once more. "We search for presence, but absence, dear Redvers, is the more truthful witness." A scuff mark ran along the skirting board just behind the stand. Fresh, faint, the sort that might be made by a damp boot sliding sideways. Whimsy tapped it with one elegant finger. Not quite damning, but suggestive. Redvers leaned closer. "From this morning?" "Possibly. Possibly last night. Possibly even the day before. but I doubt it. This place is too well tended to forgive slovenliness. Someone came in wet, clumsy, and unobserved. And the umbrella. Still missing. Our phantom walker either disposed of it or expects to reuse it. I wonder, how well does Miss Devonish know Julian Staveley? They were at Oxford together, I believe, said Redvers. She read classics. He read history badly. There was gossip. There always is. I have yet to encounter a corpse in a country house whose surrounding company had not first shared either beds, debts, or blackmail. He straightened. Let's find the good Julian. I fancy a little history lesson. They found Staveley in the small library, a room more decorative than useful, lined with leather-bound first editions chosen more for spine color than content. He was seated at a writing desk, tapping a cigarette against the rim of an ashtray with the languid irritation of a man trying to convince himself he was not waiting to be questioned. Lord Peter, he said, and the indefatigable inspector. I wondered when you'd come for me. We come for everyone eventually, said Whimsy cheerfully, dropping into an armchair, sometimes more than once, though it is a comfort when the subject greets us willingly. Now tell me, Mr. Staveley, where were you between midnight and, say, 6 in the morning? Julian gave a short laugh. I was in my room, reading until 2, then asleep. You can ask Prowse. He brought up my whiskey at 11:30. I told him not to disturb me further. And did anyone disturb you? No. Why? Because your window overlooks the garden path, and someone was out walking early this morning. Julian paused, just long enough to suggest he had not expected that line of inquiry. Oh, yes, I thought I saw someone, a figure near the yew hedge. I assumed it was one of the gardeners, though 6 seemed early for raking. A woman's figure, Whimsy clarified. In a black coat, possibly Miss Devonish. Julian gave a half shrug. Could have been. She's a terrible insomniac. How thoughtful of you to observe. I observe everyone. I'm a historian. It's what we do. Compile the past, however unflattering. And did you observe anything else? Say, a light in the chapel, a door ajar. Julian hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. Look, I did see something odd. Around 2:30, I got up for a cigarette and looked out again. The vestry door was open, just standing there, no one around. But you didn't go down to investigate? He scoffed. What am I, Sherlock Holmes? I figured it was one of the staff, or the wind. And Dr. Gallowglass? Whimsy asked. Did you see him at all yesterday evening? No, not since dinner. He said he was going to work in the music room. And no one saw him alive after that. Julian gave him a hard look. What exactly are you getting at? That depends on how much you're willing to get out, said Whimsy. You've a reputation for biting sarcasm, Mr. Staveley, but I find most sarcasm is simply a means of avoiding the truth. The truth, Julian said, is that Gallowglass was a self-important ass, with a flair for the melodramatic. He made enemies by accident and friends by effort, but I didn't kill him. No one ever does at first glance, said Whimsy lightly, rising. But thank you. One can learn a great deal from omission. As they walked back through the corridor, Redvers frowned. Do you believe him? I believe he saw the vestry door open. I don't believe he sat up until 2 without going down to investigate. Not a man with his curious streak. He knows more. But whether that makes him a killer or simply a coward, I've not yet decided. Redvers hesitated. Miss Devonish said she didn't see Julian. Julian says he saw her. One of them is lying. Or both are, said Whimsy. There's a distinct odor of collusion in the air, like poorly stored Stilton. It catches one off guard. He paused outside the music room door and gestured for Redvers to follow. The room was unchanged since the body had been removed, the lid of the grand piano still open, the chair still pulled at a slight angle, the desk stacked neatly with pages covered in a hand of obsessive precision. The air still retained the faintest metallic trace of something more final than ink. Whimsy walked to the desk, skimming the pages with a light hand. Ah, here it is. Temporum Mystica, Chronotheological Refractions in 13th Century Visionary Texts. A page-turner, if you like your pages unreadable. Redvers stood by the fire, watching. Could that have been the motive? Something in his research? If so, it would need to be more than academic rivalry. No one murders over footnotes unless the footnote is about money. Whimsy flipped another page, then paused. Here. This is new. A note, not in Gallowglass's hand, tucked between two pages. Cheap paper, scrawled hastily in ink that had bled from the damp. You were warned. Stay out of the archives. There are names better left in darkness. Whimsy held it up carefully. Charming. It seems our late doctor had ventured somewhere unapproved, possibly even dangerous. You think someone killed him over that? Not directly, but I think he stumbled across something or someone that was meant to remain hidden. A secret tethered to this house like a corpse in the well. It floats to the surface in time. Redvers looked grim. And now what? Now, said Whimsy, folding the note, we pay a visit to the archives. The house archives were housed, predictably, in the oldest and least ventilated part of Henshire Court, the west wing, where the stone was darker, the air cooler, and the electric light bulbs dimmed in faint protest. Whimsy and Redvers approached a low, arched door at the end of a narrow corridor lined with portraits so faded that even the eyes had relinquished their watchfulness. Whimsy paused before the door, peering at a brass plate engraved simply, Records. Remarkably unpoetic, he said, testing the latch. One expects at least repository of obscure knowledge or chamber of secrets. This has all the drama of a filing cabinet. The door creaked open, because of course it creaked, and revealed a long, low room with sagging shelves, a few locked cabinets, and a single, narrow window that admitted less light than a prison slit. Dust swirled like old breath in the beam of Whimsy's torch as he stepped inside. Dear me, he murmured. The ghosts of clerks passed. Redvers, less romantic, pulled the chain on a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light flickered to life and cast jaundiced shadows over parchment-bound ledgers, bundles of tied letters, and a scattering of objects not immediately recognizable as useful. Whimsy moved to a battered writing desk by the window, where a few folders had been laid out more recently, perhaps by Gallowglass himself. "This is what I find interesting," Whimsy said, fingering the topmost folder. Our deceased academic had apparently been investigating the estate's spiritual history, local legends, clerical appointments, ecclesiastical disputes. See here, correspondence from 1849 between a former vicar and the Bishop of Exeter concerning improper liturgical innovations. How thrilling. Redvers looked over his shoulder. Occult stuff. In a Church of England sort of way. More candle than cauldron. But note the margin scribbles. Gallowglass underlined the mention of a Reverend Lysander Bream and wrote, "See also Lady H. Diary, references to seance." Whimsy turned to the next page. Now this is something, a list of names from a guest book dated 1904, and one of them is underlined, C. Draycott. Redvers was already writing. That's the name on the bookplate in the volume Devonish gave him, wasn't it? The very same. Our enigmatic donor. Why would Gallowglass connect a century-old visitor with contemporary murder? Whimsy lifted the file carefully. Beneath it, more notes in Gallowglass' fine hand. Translations, extracts, and sketches of architectural features from the chapel. The stone font, a trapdoor noted but crossed out, and the Latin inscription along the vestry arch. Temporum tenebrae revelabunt omnia. In time's darkness, all shall be revealed. How very biblical. Redvers moved toward a narrow wooden cupboard built into the wall. Locked, he announced after trying the handle. Whimsy joined him, examining the simple brass keyhole. "Shall we pretend to be burglars? I do have a rather ignoble set of talents." From his coat pocket he produced a set of tools, slim, well-used, and gleaming faintly. In less than a minute, the lock clicked. Inside, behind a dusty glass pane, were three objects: a bundle of yellowed paper, a crucifix with a missing arm, and a small lacquered box with a cracked lid. Whimsy took out the bundle first and untied the red ribbon. The pages were fragile but legible, and covered in a cramped, frantic hand. "Good Lord," he murmured. "It's a confession." Redvers leaned in, reading over his shoulder. "That looks like Bream's handwriting, doesn't it?" "Indeed." Whimsy scanned the top lines. "I fear I have loosed something I cannot now recall. The rites were improper. I believed I was sanctifying the chapel, but what entered was not of heaven." He raised an eyebrow. My. Now that is spicy. Sounds like he went mad, or wished to sound mad. Confessions rarely arrive in neat categories. This could be a cover for something entirely human, an affair, a theft, a scandal. He writes of voices, dreams, and a woman in black who stands at the chapel door but never enters. A metaphor, I suspect. Redvers looked uneasy. Or a warning. Possibly. But we are not writing ghost stories, Inspector. We are unraveling knots. And this knot leads, I think, to Miss Devonish again. He returned the papers and turned to the box. Inside was a small brooch, a cameo of a woman's profile, delicate and almost worn smooth, and a photograph. Faded nearly to illegibility, but clearly of the same brooch pinned at the throat of a young woman in Edwardian dress. "No name," Whimsy said, "but I'd wager this is C. Draycott. And that this," he lifted the brooch, "was passed from her to Gallowglass via Miss Devonish. The question is, why?" Redvers looked grim. "We could ask her." "Not yet. Let her stew a while. Fear produces clarity, sometimes even confession." He closed the cupboard and wiped his hands. "Let us walk. I want to look again at the chapel. Not the crime scene, mind you, just the building." The sky had darkened while they were indoors, and the garden was heavy with that breathless pre-storm tension that turned bird calls to silence. They approached the chapel, its crooked spire barely visible against the graying clouds, and entered through the side door. Whimsy moved with deliberate steps, circling the font, the altar, and finally the vestry. His fingers trailed along the stone, pausing at the inscription once more. Revelations in darkness. But what darkness? He crouched by the north wall, where a narrow panel of wood appeared newer than its surroundings. Tapping it, he heard a faint hollowness beneath. "Now that is interesting. See the seam here? This isn't structural. It's a door, or was once." Redvers joined him, squinting. "Concealed?" "Very nearly, but not recently disturbed, I think. Our killer may not have found it, or may have had no need. Whatever was hidden here is long gone." He stood. "Still, there's something charming about murderers who are also historians." Redvers looked about the dim chapel uneasily. "So what do we actually know?" "That Gallowglass received an artifact, or several, that tied back to a former guest, a woman connected to a disgraced clergyman. He began to poke into the house's past and was warned off. He persisted, and now he's dead. Motive? Reputation, perhaps. Gallowglass may have discovered something too scandalous to allow publication, or too profitable to let go. Secrets are valuable things, Redvers. And suspects?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "Miss Devonish for lying. Staveley for seeing too much. Possibly even Lady Evendale, if she's more than the distant benefactor she claims to be. Oh, and let's not forget the servants. Prowse seems almost theatrically discreet." As they exited the chapel, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. Whimsy paused on the threshold, looking up at the iron sky. "The stage is nearly set," he said. "All we need now is the right question in the wrong ear. Someone will falter." Redvers glanced sideways. "And when they do?" "We shall be waiting in the wings, Inspector, with a spotlight." The thunder, having announced itself with pomp, seemed content to lurk moodily behind the hills as Lord Peter Wimsey and Inspector Redvers made their way back to the house. The air had thickened, damp and metallic, and somewhere above the clouds brooded like a quarrelsome relative denied the last word. At the front steps, Prowse awaited them with his customary air of studied neutrality, though Wimsey fancied the butler's expression had acquired a subtle stiffness, as though events were beginning to lean too close for comfort. "Lady Evendale requests your presence in the drawing-room, my lord," Prowse said, and then, almost imperceptibly, "She is rather distressed." Wimsey blinked once. "Oh dear. Not another séance, I trust?" Prowse did not smile. "Not to my knowledge, sir." They found her in a high-backed chair by the fireplace, though the hearth remained empty and cold. A silver tea service, untouched, occupied a low table nearby, and Lady Evendale herself had the look of a woman who had walked too far into fog and was only now wondering which direction she'd come from. She looked up as they entered, her fingers knotting a lace handkerchief with mechanical precision. "I understand," she said without preamble, "that you have been prying into the West Wing." Wimsey inclined his head. "I've been delicately unfastening the past, Lady Evendale. The operation requires precision, not force." "I trusted Gallowglass," she said abruptly. "He was discreet, intellectual." "Odd, yes, but I didn't think he would ever resort to that sort of vulgar sensationalism." Wimsey sat opposite her, crossing one leg over the other with easy elegance. "And what sort of sensationalism would that be?" She hesitated, then exhaled through her nose like someone admitting defeat in a long battle. "The kind that digs up family secrets best left buried. This house has endured 3 centuries of quiet scandal, Lord Peter. We contain it, we do not publish it." Redvers stood by the window, silent but attentive. Wimsey gave the handkerchief a dry glance. "May I hazard a guess, Lady Evendale, that Gallowglass stumbled upon a connection between yourself and one Miss C. Draycott?" The handkerchief froze. For a moment she was utterly still, then she gave a short, bitter laugh. "Well, the bloodhound has teeth." "Merely a keen nose," Wimsey murmured, "and the occasional itch in the cerebral cortex. Miss Draycott stayed here in 1904. She was gifted a brooch. She left behind a photograph." "You were what?" "Her cousin." "No," Lady Evendale said, her voice tightening. "Her daughter." The silence that followed was the sort of silence usually achieved in well-insulated rooms after a distant explosion. "I see," said Wimsey after a beat. "And no one knew?" "My parents arranged for her birth to be hidden. She was raised by an aunt in Vienna until war broke out. She came back, a stranger. Educated, theatrical, a little too fond of esoteric studies. She called herself Cassandra by then, though her name was Marion. She came here in '04 under the name Draycott, because she fancied herself a medium. She had a little following in Bloomsbury. She was supposed to conduct a spiritual investigation of the chapel." Her voice grew taut. It was all rather absurd. "But she left something behind," Wimsey said. Lady Evendale nodded. "Not intentionally. Gallowglass found her diary, or part of it, among the boxed estate papers. It confirmed our relation. She hinted at some ritual, performed with the Reverend Bream. Afterwards, she was ill, raved, left for Switzerland and died there within the year. And Gallowglass thought it was more than a nervous collapse. Yes, he thought it was a haunting or a curse, or, worse, a scandal he could publish with academic flair. He was assembling material. I begged him to stop. I even offered to fund another expedition of his, but he was obsessed." Wimsey leaned forward. "Then allow me the rude question, Lady Evendale. Did you kill him?" She looked at him then, not with indignation, but with the weary loathing reserved for tedious formalities. "No, Lord Peter, I did not kill him. If I had, I would have burned every scrap of that diary with him." Redvers stirred. Would anyone else have wanted it destroyed? Lady Evendale gave a brittle smile. "Oh, I imagine half the household. You've no idea how corrosive secrets can be when they've gone sour in the dark." Whimsy stood. "That's very illuminating. Thank you." Outside, the clouds had finally decided to express themselves, and a thin, spitting rain streaked the tall windows. Whimsy turned toward the library, ignoring Redvers' attempt at a question. Staveley was inside, surrounded by towers of his own making. He looked up as they entered, owl-eyed and faintly affronted. "I am terribly busy," he said. Whimsy picked up a loose sheaf from the table. "Cataloguing the Gallowglass files, are we? Fascinating. Tell me, Mr. Staveley, did you ever read the diary pages he found?" Staveley blinked, his face twitching toward blandness. "What diary?" "The one Gallowglass found in the West Wing, belonging to a Miss Draycott." Staveley swallowed. "He mentioned fragments, something about spiritualism, but he didn't let me see much. But he did show them to Miss Devonish." "I suppose. They spent more time together than he did with anyone else. I always thought she was feeding his fantasies." Whimsy nodded slowly. "That may be. Did he ever mention a Reverend Bream to you?" "Vaguely. Said he was a mad vicar with a Gothic flair." "And the brooch? Did you know its origin?" "No," Staveley said too quickly. "I never saw it." Whimsy turned toward the door. "Quite so. Come, Redvers. Let us bother Miss Devonish again. She has been strangely absent." They found her, after some delay, in the orangery, standing near the glass wall and looking out at the storm, her reflection fractured in the wet panes like a ghost half-written. She turned as they approached, her expression guarded. "Back again," she said. "Shall I make tea?" "Not just yet," Whimsy said. "We've been tracing a brooch." "Ah," she gave him a dry smile. "You found the photograph?" "Quite, and the box it was kept in, with a very interesting diary." "Then you know, I suppose, about Cassandra, about the chapel. I know there's a tangle of family shame, false identities, and something the modern mind prefers not to name. But what did Gallowglass tell you?" "Not everything," she said, her voice quieter. "He trusted me, but he didn't share. He was afraid toward the end. Paranoid. Thought someone was watching him. He kept saying the umbrella was wrong." Redvers frowned. "The umbrella?" She turned to the glass again. The one he always left in the hall. He swore it had moved. Twice. Whimsy tilted his head. "And you thought?" "I thought he was imagining things. But then I noticed something. One evening, after supper, he said he'd locked his notes in the east cabinet. The next morning, they were in the west cupboard. He didn't move them, I didn't either." "And no one else had a key?" She shook her head. "Not unless they took it from him. He carried it on a ribbon." Whimsy gave a short breath of amusement. "We are now at the point where the inanimate is rearranging itself." "Excellent." She looked at him. "You think I'm lying?" "I think," said Whimsy, "you are frightened. Not of ghosts, Miss Devonish, but of the truth behind them. What was so terrifying that Gallowglass began to see omens in umbrellas?" She was silent a moment, then said, "He told me something, just once, that the chapel wasn't built where it is by accident, that it had been moved, not physically, but spiritually. The cornerstone came from a monastery dissolved under Henry VIII. The stone had a mark. He called it a sign of inversion. He thought it corrupted the building." Whimsy's eyes lit faintly. "An architectural haunting. How divine." But he was serious. He thought the stone was connected to Bream's madness and to Cassandra's visions. "And he was going to publish this?" "Yes, with my help." until he died. Whimsy looked at her. Then why haven't you left? She gave him a brittle smile. Because I want to know who moved the umbrella. Whimsy studied Miss Devonish a moment longer, the lines of his face shifting into that peculiar expression he wore when he was amused and sharpening a blade at once. The storm outside, now speaking in a slow, rattling monologue, formed an eerie accompaniment to the silence that gathered in the orangery between them. Then, with an easy, almost idle pivot of tone, he said, "Tell me, did Gallowglass ever give you the dates?" She blinked. Dates. The diary entries. The sessions Cassandra conducted in the chapel. If Gallowglass was building a theory around the spiritual infection of a place, then I imagine he would have paid slavish attention to chronology. The devil, as they say, has a punctual wristwatch. She hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a small notebook. Its cover was battered, the leather cracked like old varnish. She handed it to him without ceremony. He gave me this the week before he died, told me not to mention it, said he wanted me to keep it, just in case. Whimsy took it delicately, as though it might dissolve into dust at the faintest breath. Inside, in Gallowglass's brisk, meticulous hand, were several pages of notes, dated, cross-referenced, and spiked with margin exclamations. The first entry read, 12th October, 1904. CD and Bream begin preliminary cleansing ritual. 3:15 p.m. Reported dizziness and low vibration. Whimsy flipped further. Here. 15th October. CD claims a knocking behind the south wall. Drew symbol in chalk. Fainting episode. Bream notes bleeding from nose. Claims the stone burned cold. How very Byronic. He closed the Pied book gently. Redvers, how far is the rectory from here? 3/4 of a mile, through the south gate. Splendid. Let's walk. Miss Devonish, who had taken to twisting her hands in her sleeves, frowned. You think there's something at the chapel? I think there's something missing from the chapel, Whimsy said, and I'd rather like to ask the current rector whether he's been dreaming of upside-down altars. As they made their way toward the south gate, Whimsy kept his eyes on the gravel path, his steps oddly light for the rain now steadily wetting his hat. Redvers, he said softly. What time did Gallowglass arrive at the hall the day before he died? About 11 in the morning. And dinner was served at 7? Yes. He went to the chapel again just before 6, alone. And where was the umbrella? In the hall, the same as always. Whimsy nodded absently. He told Devonish it had moved, that it had been tampered with. He even went so far as to switch it for another, but the only people who knew it had changed were himself and the person who changed it. Redvers looked over. You think the umbrella's movement is the key? I think it is not the umbrella, Whimsy said, pausing to lift his cane at a nettle. It is the knowledge of its movement that matters. And the only way Gallowglass could have known absolutely that it had moved was if it was no longer the umbrella he had placed there. In other words, if it had been replaced by an identical one. Redvers gave him a long look. A duplicate? Whimsy smiled faintly. A planted clue. Or a warning. The rectory was a square, inelegant affair of Georgian brick, squatting behind a hedge that seemed to resent its own shape. The current incumbent, a Reverend Gifford, was a mild, stooping man with a moustache like a walnut whip and the misfortune of looking perpetually apologetic. He greeted them at the door with a surprised, Lord Peter. Oh dear, has something happened? Not another séance, I hope. Whimsy made all necessary reassurances, and was soon seated with Redvers and the rector in a sitting-room that smelt gently of worn hymnals and faint disapproval. Tell me, Whimsy said, stirring the rector's rather heroic tea, do you keep any records of what was moved into or out of the chapel in the past century? Gifford blinked. I suppose. There's an old register, most of its parish repairs, tile work, guttering. Why? There was a stone, Whimsy said. a foundation stone brought over from a dissolved monastery, St. Adalbert's, I believe, carved with a peculiar sigil. "Oh, yes," said Gifford. "It's still there. Fixed behind the altar, set in the wall, but it was odd." "How so?" "Well, the stonemason in '88, when they were repairing the east wall, wrote a letter to my predecessor. Said the stone had been inverted." "Inverted?" "Upside down. The sigil carved into it reads differently when reversed. I've seen it. Looks like a serpent swallowing itself. Very esoteric. No idea what it means." "But it was not put right." "No. The bishop advised leaving it. Said tampering with relics of pre-Reformation origin could offend some of the, keener donors." Whimsy gave a soft whistle. "How delightfully Anglican." Back at the hall, Whimsy declined supper and made instead for the west wing with a lantern and no small air of suppressed excitement. He passed through the arched corridor leading to the chapel, the old stones shivering slightly beneath his tread as though uncertain of their position in the world. In the chapel proper, he paused. The air was damp, but not foul. The mustiness had the restrained air of ecclesiastical rot. He knelt behind the altar. There, set into the wall, was the stone. The sigil was visible. Barely. A worn, looping knot that twisted into itself with unsettling persistence. Above it, faint scratches where someone had once tried to chisel, but stopped. He traced it once with a gloved finger, then stood. "Redvers," he said softly, "do you recall what Miss Devonish said about Gallowglass's notes being moved?" "Yes." "Well, here's the thought. Suppose someone wanted to prevent Gallowglass from publishing this. Not kill him, not at first, but rattle him. Show they had access, knowledge. Suppose they moved his notes from one place to another. Then moved the umbrella, but then Gallowglass changes the umbrella, puts out a decoy, it vanishes. That tells him someone's on to him. But who?" "Ah," said Whimsy, smiling thinly. "That's the next dance. We need to know who had access to that umbrella, and more importantly, who knew about the diary. Because there's a gap in those entries I've just noticed. October 18th to 20th. Missing. And I suspect that's the part someone killed to protect." Redvers looked grave. "So, who's your suspect?" Whimsy stared at the stone. "Anyone who benefits from silence, and someone very close indeed to the house. After all, the umbrella stayed in the hall." Whimsy had not returned immediately to his room that night. Instead, he had drifted back to the drawing-room, where the fire had sunk to a red eye and the air was filled with the faint ghost of sherry. He sat, unmoving, in one of the old damask chairs, contemplating the implications of an umbrella, a vanished notebook, and a chapel with its stone heart set upside down. His fingers drummed lightly on the chair's worn armrest, beating a rhythm not unlike a Morse code message only he could decipher. By morning, he was up early, lingering by the breakfast table with a dish of kedgeree he ignored in favor of picking idly at the toast rack. Redvers entered, bleary but alert, with a manila folder tucked under his arm. "I rang town last night after you went back to the chapel," he said, sliding into the seat opposite. "Had them run a background trace on Cassandra Devonish's early career." Whimsy lifted a brow. "You suspected her of intrigue?" "Not at first, but something she said yesterday, it didn't quite sit. About Bream's weakness in the early days of the séances." "Yes, I remember. A curious term, almost clinical." "Well, it turns out that Miss Devonish had a stint at the St. Bartholomew's School of Mesmeric Therapy in 1911. Only 6 months, mind you, but it's in the record. She left suddenly, no given reason." Whimsy gave a soft whistle. "Bartholomew's, where they were experimenting with hypnotic regression and identity dissociation under Dr. Harrowley." "Yes, I remember the scandal. 3 nurses had a nervous collapse, and a 4th developed glossolalia. The poor girl never quite recovered her English." "Exactly. And Gallowglass, before he turned to archaeology, also had a brief interest in abnormal psychology. They could have met then. Whimsy's toast paused in mid-air. Ah, then this wasn't simply antiquarian flirtation. This was an experiment. That's the working theory. Whimsy gave a slow nod, setting down the toast. So, Gallowglass and Devonish, early collaborators, attempt a quasi-scientific reenactment of medieval rituals using the chapel. They involve Bream, either as a willing participant or as a manipulated one. The sessions become increasingly unorthodox, perhaps even dangerous. He paused, eyes narrowing faintly. And what if Bream's breakdown wasn't just spiritual collapse? What if he saw something, knew something that the others were trying to suppress? Redvers leaned forward. That's the next piece, isn't it? Because I spoke to the housekeeper this morning and she said something odd. Apparently, Bream had a standing order for the umbrella to remain untouched in the hall, regardless of seasonal weather. Not just a habit, but a rule. She once moved it for polishing and he became absolutely livid. Whimsy leaned back, fingers steepled. It was a totem then, a marker, something he needed to verify reality, to reassure himself, perhaps, that the order of things remained intact, or that no one was meddling. He stood. Let's pay Miss Devonish a visit. They found her in the garden room, seated beneath an overgrown jasmine vine that had begun to curl in through the cracked window frame like a curious guest. She was writing in a black-bound journal and looked up without surprise when Whimsy knocked on the sill. "Come to ask more questions," she said with a thin smile. Whimsy returned it. "Always. You strike me as the sort of person who answers them in full. Eventually." He sat on the bench opposite her while Redvers remained standing, arms folded. "Tell me," said Whimsy gently. "Did you and Gallowglass ever study with Harrowley?" She blinked slowly. "So you've been rummaging." "I find rummaging very educational." Her mouth tightened. "Yes. We were there, briefly. It wasn't a good place. Harrowley was brilliant but dangerous. Gallowglass left after an incident with one of the other patients, a woman who'd undergone one too many divided consciousness sessions. He said it frightened him. And yet he returned to the idea, here, with you. We thought we could approach it differently, historically. The rituals of the 13th century weren't designed to be therapeutic, but they revealed something. When Bream agreed to take part, it felt sanctioned, as if the chapel wanted it. "Charming theology," said Whimsy, "but deadly psychology." Devonish looked away. "It wasn't meant to hurt him." "No," Whimsy said softly, "but it did. And Gallowglass knew it. Which is why, I think, he tried to bring the matter to a close. Or perhaps to warn someone, or even confess. But someone stopped him." Devonish was silent. "Did he ever mention the missing entries in his diary?" Whimsy asked. She stiffened. "No, he said it was private." "Private? Between whom? You and him?" She hesitated. "No, between him and Bream." Whimsy stood slowly, brushing dust from his sleeve. "Then I think it's time I spoke with Bream." "But he's gone?" "No, not gone, just conveniently absent." Whimsy's tone sharpened. "And I think it's time we called him back." They found him later that afternoon in the village. Rather, he found them. Bream arrived at the hall unannounced, raincoat buttoned to the throat and eyes red-rimmed. He looked worn, like a man who had been living in borrowed clothes and sleeping badly on borrowed time. "I heard you were here," he said to Whimsy, voice low. "You've spoken to Devonish?" "I have." "Then I suppose you know." "I know a number of things," Whimsy replied, "but what I don't know is whether you meant to kill him." Bream flinched. "I didn't, I swear, but I let him die." Whimsy's tone was gentle now, not accusing. "Why?" He was going to publish everything, the sessions, the manipulations, what Cassandra did. "What I did. I believed it, Lord Peter. In the chapel. I thought we were discovering something pure. But it wasn't. It was madness dressed in ceremony." So when he tried to break from it, we fought the night before he died. He told me he'd hidden the original notes, that he'd already sent copies to someone in town. I begged him not to ruin her, not to ruin me. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. Did you tamper with the umbrella? Bream hesitated. No, that wasn't me. I think he did that himself, to test us, to see if we'd noticed the switch. But someone did notice. Yes, Bream whispered, and that's what frightened him. Whimsy looked towards the fire. One more question, Mr. Bream. Why October 18th to 20th? Why are those days missing from the diary? Bream sank into the chair like a man sinking into old memory. Because something happened, something we agreed never to write down. Cassandra. She tried to push the experiment further. Gallowglass refused, but she had me. She used me. I don't even remember it all, just flashes. And then, I was ill for days. When I came to, Gallowglass had burned several pages of his journal. And the chapel. We never went back. Not properly. But he couldn't leave it alone. Neither could she. Whimsy stood. Thank you, Mr. Bream. You've been braver than most. Later, as the wind began to rise and the light narrowed into dusk, Whimsy sat alone in the chapel once more, the umbrella, original and unmistakable, resting in his lap. He turned it over slowly, fingers brushing the monogram etched beneath the silver ring. It was never about the umbrella, he murmured. It was about the signal, about who was watching, and now we shall find out who that was. He placed the umbrella carefully at the chapel's entrance, stood and waited. Whimsy stood beneath the chapel's vaulted ceiling, the candlelight flickering along the ribbed stone like breath-stirring old bones. Outside, the wind dragged its feet along the gravel, and the rain, having gathered its patience all afternoon, had begun to fall in earnest, sheeting against the narrow glass panes with theatrical persistence. Within the hush, the umbrella stood propped just inside the threshold, its handle turned precisely outward, as it had been on the day of Gallowglass's death. There it was, the bait. Not for a spirit. Whimsy was no believer in household ghosts unless they came with legal deeds or unpaid debts, but for someone who had seen that subtle change, someone who had acted on it. The entire business with the umbrella had become clearer over the course of the investigation. Not a murder weapon, not even an alibi, but a signal. Gallowglass had placed it unmistakably as a trap. The kind only one person might understand. And so Lord Peter waited. It was nearly an hour before he heard the approach. Hesitant steps outside the chapel, not muffled like boots in the mud, but sharp, deliberate. Shoes on stone, slipping and stopping, then continuing. Whimsy did not move. The figure stepped into the doorway. For a moment, the rain framed her like a halo. Cassandra Devonish, wrapped in her long sable coat, her hair pulled back, lips pale with something that was not fear, but perhaps close cousin to it. Her eyes went straight to the umbrella. "You put it back," she said. "Of course," said Whimsy, his voice drifting through the hush. "Where it belongs." Cassandra stepped forward, every movement measured, almost priestly in its grace. "You know," she said, not a question, but a confession unasked. "I know that Gallowglass set this in the hall not merely as a habit, but as a sentinel, a ward, and that someone noticed when it was replaced with the wrong one, a near copy but not the same. Silver chased instead of engraved, handle fractionally too thick, monogram forged, but inverted. And someone responded. She smiled faintly. "You think it was me." I think it had to be someone who had watched him for years, someone who knew his rituals, who had access to both umbrellas and his study, who knew where to find the diary and how to remove 3 days from it without disturbing the spine. Cassandra lowered her gaze to the stone floor. You think I killed him? Whimsy took a step forward. I think you loved him once. In your fashion. And I think when he threatened to unpick everything you'd built, your credibility, your work, your claim to the chapel's mysteries, you panicked. He was going to publish, to confess, to draw the curtains on your theater. You couldn't bear that. She gave a bitter laugh. He didn't understand. It was never about belief. It was about the idea, the need. Bream needed something to save him from himself. The village needed its history given shape. Even Gallowglass, he needed his past to become meaningful. I gave them that. I made sense of chaos by feeding them fiction wrapped in dogma. Better than the truth which no one wants. Whimsy's voice was quiet now. But Gallowglass did want the truth, and you silenced him. Cassandra stepped past the umbrella. He died of a heart attack. There's no proof of anything else. No, said Whimsy. No blood, no wounds, no missing poisons or exotic injections. But I noticed, when I examined the library more closely yesterday, that the inkwell on his desk had dried ink on the inside of the lid. Fresh. As if someone had shut it quickly after use. Not him, I think. He wrote with a fountain pen, and yet there was a smear of ink on his left cuff. Not from writing, but from holding down a page. He turned to face her fully now. You wrote the note that Redvers found in the wastebasket, the one about the chapel's alignment. You wanted it to seem as if Gallowglass had discovered something new, something worth risking exposure, but the ink didn't match his pen, nor did the paper match the stock he used. She didn't deny it. You needed a reason for him to be up late, Whimsy went on. You needed people to believe he'd been poring over notes again, obsessing. You laid the groundwork for a relapse, but he wasn't obsessed. He was preparing to let go. Cassandra's voice dropped. You have no proof I was there that night. Whimsy turned slightly, his gaze drifting to the chapel's west wall. Actually, I do. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small parcel, wrapped in oilcloth, fastened with twine. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal the broken tip of a stiletto heel. You dropped this just outside the rear vestry door, he said mildly. Miss Figg found it while gathering storm-felled branches yesterday. She mentioned it to me because she thought it was the horn of a goat, and it would be to a country eye. But it's from an Italian boot, custom-made, judging by the leather. One of the pair you were wearing the night of the village dinner, when you slipped out for an hour and a half. Claimed you'd had a headache. Her eyes flickered. So you returned to the chapel then. You meant only to scare him. Or so you told yourself. Perhaps you meant to burn the rest of the diary. Perhaps you only meant to confront him. But Gallowglass was frailer than you expected. Perhaps he raised his voice. Perhaps he fell. You panicked, and when you left, you took the real umbrella with you and swapped it in the hall, hoping no one would be mad enough to spot the difference. She was silent for a long moment, and then gave a sigh. Not weary, but curiously unburdened. He did raise his voice, she said quietly. He said I was a fraud, said I'd used him, that I'd betrayed the past we studied. I told him I'd made something beautiful from his grim little parchments and miserable footnotes. I told him, her voice caught. I told him I'd rather he died with his secrets than lived to tear everything down. Whimsy inclined his head. And so he did. She looked at him sharply. You'll turn me in? He regarded her coolly. That is, as ever, up to the Crown. But I dare say they'll be interested in your trip to Italy in 1924, the one you neglected to mention in your official record, and the unregistered prescription for chloral hydrate, bought under a false name. It wasn't used the night he died, but it suggests planning, a readiness, which tends to suggest intent. Her hands shook slightly. You're clever. No, he said. his voice utterly flat. "Just thorough, which is rather worse." She stepped back into the shadow of the archway. "May I at least take the umbrella?" Whimsy smiled faintly. He wouldn't have wanted that. He left it there for someone to notice. "I did." That evening, as the police escorted Cassandra Devonish from the hall, the storm finally passed, leaving behind it a deep stillness. The umbrella, once again, stood precisely in the hall, its curved handle gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Whimsy, preparing to leave, paused by the threshold. "Curious thing," he said to Redverse. "An umbrella standing untouched in a house for 5 years. Most people would hang up superstition with their wet coats, but Gallowglass kept his there. Just so. He knew that in the end, it wouldn't be evidence that betrayed her. It would be something far smaller, a matter of inches, of instinct, of which way the handle faced." He turned to the door and then added with a wry half-smile, "Though, to be fair, most people do forget the finer points of monogram placement." With that, Lord Peter, Whimsy stepped into the night, his own umbrella tucked neatly under one arm. Lord Peter Whimsy regarded the assembled household with an expression at once mildly amused and quietly authoritative. The library's heavy curtains were drawn tight against the creeping dusk, lending the room a brooding intimacy that suited the gravity of the moment. Everyone present, Redvers, Miss Figg, the vicar, and even the stern inspector who had reluctantly welcomed Whimsy's involvement, waited with polite impatience. "I shall be brief," Whimsy began, folding his hands behind his back as he paced slowly before the hearth. "The truth, as often happens, lies not in the grand gestures, but in the minutiae, the slight misalignment of a clock's hands, the dampness beneath a carpet's corner, or in this case, a displaced umbrella." He gestured toward the doorway, where the dark handle curved outward, a sentinel still watching the empty hall. Gallowglass was a man enslaved by his principles, principles which, in his last days, were threatened not by strangers, but by those closest to him. The forgeries, the obscured entries in his diary, the interrupted timelines, these were threads deliberately woven to mislead. Whimsy turned his sharp gaze on Cassandra Devonish's vacant chair. Miss Devonish's attempts to maintain control over the narrative were motivated, I believe, by a profound fear that the past, once illuminated in full, would unravel not only her reputation, but the fragile peace of the village itself. He paused, allowing the room to absorb the implication. The incident on the night in question was not murder in the conventional sense. There was no poison, no weapon. Instead, there was panic, a moment of overreach in which Miss Devonish confronted Gallowglass. His heart, fragile as an ancient manuscript, gave way under the strain. The inspector cleared his throat, but Whimsy continued unperturbed. Her attempt to disguise the scene, the swapped umbrella, the forged notes, the alibi gaps, were, in their way, desperate gestures to stave off the truth. But it was in the details, the ink smudges, the broken heel, the soundproofed vestry door's peculiar echo, that the deception faltered. Whimsy's lips curled into a faint, ironic smile. One might say that even the most elaborate ruses cannot escape the natural order of cause and effect, and that the best lies, like ill-cut cigars, reveal their true nature with close inspection. He glanced around, eyes resting on each listener. Thus, the umbrella stayed in the hall, not merely as a signpost, but as a silent witness. It was the last honest thing Gallowglass placed, and the first detail the guilty sought to distort. By restoring it, we restore the truth. With a final, deliberate nod, Whimsy turned toward the door. Justice, I trust, will be served with the same quiet inevitability. And in the meantime, may I recommend a good cigar and a touch less theatricality for all concerned. As he passed out into the night, the household remained silent, the weight of revelation settling like the last flicker of candlelight. Outside, the wind whispered once more through the chapel's ancient eaves, but now with the faintest note of closure.